Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Today I want to talk about commodities. Commodities are raw materials or agricultural goods that are usually inputs for finished manufactured products. Think Durasteel, which is used in the construction of many types of ships and also buildings, or something like Veraxia renanacus, a barley that is used in the production process for Bacta. Commodities prices are important in a large, connected, galactic economy because large changes in input prices can severely affect the price of finished goods and even services in some cases. For instance, if you raise the price of hypermatter fuel, which is used in hyperdrives and allows starships to travel at faster than light speeds, then you can expect that any products that these ships are carrying are also going to have an increase in price. Now, traders can speculate on the prices of commodities in the exchanges and markets by buying products like a futures contract. This allows you to have more liquidity and capital in the supply chain and allows producers to hedge against uncertainty or the loss of future revenue. For instance, if you're a moisture farmer on Tatooine and you're really unsure what the seasonal moisture outlook will be for the year, you can only sell future contracts to buyers in the beginning of year that allows them to purchase your yearly crop of moisture at a fixed rate to make sure that you will recoup all of your expenses in case something disastrous happens, like Jawa comes and, destroys the entire water economy. The person who buys your contract is betting on the fact that there will be a shortage in water and water prices will go up, and so he will have bought your crop of water at a pretty large discount. But even with all these buyers offering more liquidity, volatility and price swings are quite common in less developed and stable parts of the commodities markets, or if there are, galaxy-wide wars and trade tensions. For instance, if the Empire suddenly just decides to blow up Alderaan, you're going to see a change in certain commodity prices, especially when it comes to products like star blossoms, which I believe are only found on Alderaan, right? So if you destroy the only source of that commodity, suddenly those prices go through the roof. This can lead to some major issues to the wider market if the commodity is something that is essential to keeping the galactic economy running properly. For instance, during the Stark Hyperspace War, one of the major Alizé processing plants, one of the basic components of Bacta, was destroyed. This led to a huge disruption in Bacta shipment. This led to shortages in poorer region, whereas regions who could afford to pay the higher prices of Bacta started hoarding the miracle fluid. The result was many of the wounded Planetary Defense Force troopers who were fighting in the conflict were not able to treat their wounds properly, and they ended up hideously scarred. Also, many medical clinics and hospitals across the galaxy started limiting the use of Bacta only for emergency cases. Generally, when a commodity shortage like this happens, moves are made by the industry or by government to stabilize prices. And that's because in larger, more complex economies, especially ones where supply chains spread all across a galaxy, when you have a sudden increase or decrease in input prices because of commodities, you can expect huge problems all along the supply chain. Sometimes it's not even easy to predict. This is why when you make trade policy, you have to be very careful and precise in how you do things. Otherwise, you can affect millions and billions of people's lives. You can make the cost of goods that people need on a daily basis get out of control. Here on Earth, one of the most important commodities we have is energy, specifically crude oil. This is why we have organizations like OPEC, which is essentially a crude oil cartel made up of many of the leading producers of oil in the planet. Together, OPEC decides how much oil each country is going to produce in order to stabilize oil prices. Sometimes too much competition is actually very bad. I mean, you take a look at the Sith, right? At one point, they're so destructive that whenever they defeated the Republic, they would start competing amongst each other and destroy any gains they created. The same thing goes in capitalism. Too much competition destroys everyone. So, if every nation tried to produce as much oil as possible, global oil prices would drop rapidly, and in the short run, that would benefit consumers and industry, but it would also damage and bankrupt many of the large oil producers as their profitability is lost once oil drops below a certain price per barrel. And of course, when these oil producers go out of business, new companies will come out, take over that infrastructure, reopen the wells, and continue doing those things. But in that gap, when you have a loss of oil production, oil prices can fluctuate at crazy amounts, and that can affect the entire economy. It could create a recession, it could create wars. You really never know. Now, OPEC is far from a perfect system, and like any powerful organization in the world, you're going to have detractors and supporters. It should be mentioned that one of the largest oil producers in the world, the United States, is not a part of OPEC. And that is actually because we're a large producer, but we're not a net exporter of oil, which is one of the preconditions of joining OPEC. Other countries like Indonesia, Mordor, and Canada also aren't in the organization, but by choice. Also, a lot of member states of OPEC actually cheat and don't meet their promised oil production targets, which of course can force other members to produce less or more. So it's a tricky situation. So OPEC is a controversial organization, but I think it's very natural for these type of regulatory bodies to be created in more complex and important commodities markets like crude oil. As the global economy expands more and more, as more lives are connected to each other, I think you're going to see these kind of regulatory bodies pop up in a lot of industries to try to promote stability. Another way for companies to stabilize commodities prices is through improving the technology and methods of resource extraction. One of the really cool aspects of Star Wars is that we are dealing with an entire galaxy. It's not just Earth, where we kind of already understand our limits, how much we can expand and how much we can grow. In Star Wars, like the ceiling is a lot higher, right? It's almost endless growth opportunity. What's interesting is just like here on Earth, in the Star Wars galaxy, most of the resource extraction sites in the older core regions are fully tapped out or have been shut down for environmental reasons. And this pushes resource extraction operations towards the Outer Rim, where you have more untouched planets, but also less infrastructure, more pirates and bandits. What we'll see in Star Wars is that companies will take the risk of expanding to these remote areas, but they aren't necessarily going to build large permanent bases because, there's a lot of larger macro challenges, there are a lot of political issues, and there's always the threat, of course, of bandits coming in and just taking over your entire operation. Because remember, the Outer Rim is not going to be patrolled by the Republic. And so what a lot of Star Wars companies actually have done are create these large vehicles, bases, mobile resource extraction cities almost. And they're actually quite popular in Star Wars. And today I want to take a look at a few of them because these are some of the most interesting vehicles in the Star Wars galaxy. Yes, they're not built for war. Yes, they're not built for design or speed, but they are very, very much functional. And I think a large part of the economic growth that happens in the Outer Rim, at least before the Free Trade Zone, is thanks to these kind of crazy mega constructions. Lando Calrissian is an impressive man. He's a visionary and a risk taker, someone who is willing to push the boundaries of what is possible in order to make a profit. People know him as the administrator of Cloud City on Bespin, a beautiful luxurious settlement built around Tabana gas manufacturing. But I believe his most impressive project is actually the resource extraction project on Niklon. See, Niklon is a place that most mining conglomerates would ignore. On paper, the planet's crust was indeed rich with minerals like porphyrium, cameras, and dolomite, important materials used in starship construction. The planet's surface was also relatively unstable and young, a lot of volcanic activity. There are also a lot of minerals being brought up to the surface from these volcanic kind of movements beneath the surface. Now, the only problem was this planet was extremely close to its star. Luckily, the planet did rotate very slowly. It takes about 3,527 hours or 90 standard days to make one revolution. This meant that one side of the planet was always baked in just ungodly amounts of heat and radiation, and basically you can't walk around there at all. It doesn't matter what kind of protection you have on, it's just not survivable. Whereas the other half of the planet is pitch black and in the dark and relatively cool. It's basically that planet from Pitch Black, just no bioraptors. And it was in the shadow of this planet that Lando Calrissian wanted to make his big bucks. See, Lando was a very creative individual. Where other people saw risk, he saw opportunity. And so he would commission the construction of a massive mobile mining facility called Nomad City. The way he did this was kind of crazy. He took 40 captured AT-AT walkers and mounted an old Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser on top of it. And so this city, at a very slow and constant pace, would just walk with the rotation of the planet and stay in the shadow forever. Nomad City had a large complement of mining vessels called mole miners that could dig into the planet's soft crust and find veins to extract. Now, if anything happened to Nomad City's propulsion, then you have a small window of time, weeks sometimes, to repair this vehicle. Otherwise, it's going to get destroyed by the other side of the planet. Now, getting to Nomad City was also pretty tricky. You see, Nikolon was so close to its star that even starships had problems landing on the planet. The extreme radiation and heat was just too much for most materials, and so Lando would actually build large shield ships with massive umbrella-like structures designed to reflect the star's energy. Behind the umbrella, normal ships could slave their controls and make the journey to Nikolon in the shield ship's shadow through a micro-hyperspace jump. Yes, this is a lot like the vessels from Sunshine when humanity needs to restart the sun by nuking it. And yeah, this is the only safe way to get to Nikolon, and then Nomad City was the only way to safely mine Nikolon. Overall, this is an extremely expensive and risky mining operation. Like, a lot of things can go wrong, right? If one shield ship breaks, you can't resupply. If Nomad City breaks, you have a lot of people who need to get off that planet immediately. So I think what Lando is after a lot of times is not just money. He's looking for challenges. He's looking for exciting and very difficult opportunities, and he basically likes to test himself. That's why Lando is an interesting business person to follow, but not someone you'd want to invest money with at all. The Sandcrawler is one of the first ground vehicle we see in the original Star Wars film. This 40-meter long and 20-meter high tracked vehicle was the home and transportation for a tribe of Jawas living on Tatooine. Tatooine is an extremely dry and hostile planet, full of all sorts of dangerous beasts like crate dragons and roving bands of Tusken Raiders. From an evolutionary standpoint, the diminutive Jawas were at quite a disadvantage, and they struggled to survive, preferring to hide in canyons and caves rather than the open. But the appearance of sandcrawlers, or dicker crawlers, as the miners who used them used to call them, allowed the Jawas to leverage their intelligence. They would develop mechanical skills and knowledge relatively quickly and begin to operate these massive vehicles and use them as their homes. As a scavenger species, the Jawas would collect technology and scrap metal and sell things while traveling around the planet on their mobile massive fortress, which of course protected them from most dangers. The Sandcrawlers we're seeing on Tatooine and also Arvala 7 are built by Corellia Mining Corporation. These vehicles not only carried miners and their equipment around hostile environments, they also had an ore refinery built inside along with labs to test the quality of the minerals. This entire vehicle was powered by a pretty primitive technology, nuclear fusion, but it's very reliable and it can go on forever. The outside of the vehicle was covered in Durasteel plate armor to protect it from the elements and also hostile creatures, which was a good thing because this vehicle only had a top speed of around 30 kilometers per hour. The Sandcrawlers were relatively cheap to manufacture at around 50,000 credits per unit, which means that when Corellia Mining Corporation realized that the mineral deposits on Tatooine were far poorer than initial scans revealed, they just left these vehicles behind as the cost of transporting them was considered too high. Interestingly enough, it wasn't only the Corellians who were fooled by Tatooine's arid surface. Long ago, during the Old Republic era, Sursica Corporation also tried to carry out a similar venture on Tatooine. Sursica, by the way, are the individuals behind the cycler rifles that the Tusken Raiders seem to love so much. Sursica would send the multi-environment track transport a much larger Sandcrawler than what the Corellians used. It was considered one of the most complicated ground vehicles at the time, but even that vehicle wasn't able to produce much from Tatooine's surface. It should be noted the main reason why these companies use Sandcrawlers with track vehicles and not repulsor lifts is because repulsor lifts do not perform well in sand, because sand is coarse and rough and irritating. It gets everywhere. While the Resistance animated series never quite took off, it definitely had a few cool aspects to it, like the Colossus, where most of the show takes place. This is really a one-of-a-kind vehicle/platform. Built by Quad Drive Yards, the Colossus was technically a super tanker fuel depot, but what made it unique is that not only could it fly in space like a starship, it could also land on planets and traverse the ocean like a large tanker. When floating on the water, most of the ship is actually hidden below the waves. Now, typically, these type of super tankers are designed to ferry fuel from one system to another, and that's probably what the Colossus did when it was in the service of the Empire. But once the Empire collapsed, probably after Endor, it seems like this tanker was kind of just left behind on the ocean planet of Castellon. Furthermore, its captain, a former Imperial named Emmanuel Doza, had opened the ship to outside visitors. Typically, these type of supertankers have a very small crew and a lot of automation, but the Colossus was more like a small city, a cruise ship of sorts. You have a diverse population who all play different roles on the ship. Some act as vendors, others as traders and mechanics. And then, of course, you have all of the races, which bring in a healthy amount of gambling revenue. One can actually argue that the racing on the Colossus was more important than the supertanker's fuel cells. I find it very interesting at the core of Star Wars is this Republic that operates a large galactic economy that is mostly driven by free market policies and ideas. This is why you have a lot of excesses. You have these companies taking huge risks by building these massive platforms like the Colossus, like these sand crawlers, Nomad City and the Shield ship. I mean, even things like Cloud City on Bestman is a sign of, very advanced capital markets and people being able to invest tons of money to create these kind of ideas. On the flip side, we have the rest of the people in Star Wars, the average citizen, the laborer, and most of them are not a part of the economy. A lot of them, especially in the Outer Rim, are scavengers. I mean, they are working on barter. They don't even have credits or money. And as these mega conglomerates' large resource extraction operations fail, all of this infrastructure is basically just written off as a loss for tax reasons, I guess. And what happens? Well, the average person in Star Wars moves into this infrastructure and recycles it and basically turns it into a home. There's something very off-putting and apocalyptic about this, right? It's almost like the equality in the galaxy, the income inequality in the galaxy has just gotten completely out of control, where you literally have people just living in the trash of companies. But anyway, I found this all very interesting. I love these massive vehicles, these large kind of self-contained mineral extraction vehicles. This is something that you only get in science fiction. I don't think we can actually build things like this here on Earth just yet. But maybe one day in the future, once we start exploring other planets, we can do this. Who knows? Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.